did you learn about misheard from the results of the MMPI too?
Quite a bit. I wrote up a 25-page interpretation outline. It has numerous scales. So one of the reasons I like this measure so much is that it can tell you so much about multiple different traits and tendencies and mental issues. One of the primary things I learned was that she had a very sophisticated way of minimizing any personal problems. I also learned that she tends to, well, there were a number of characteristics that were consistent with the eventual diagnoses, but some of the primary characteristics, and I'm going to try to condense 25 pages here, were essentially externalization of blame, tending to have a lot of inner hostility that is attempted to be controlled, a tendency to be very self-righteous, but to also deny that self-righteousness and to judge others critically against these sort of high standards for moral value, but also to deny doing that, essentially to claim that one is very non-judgmental and accepting and yet very full of rage, really. And these aren't facts, but her scores essentially correlated, so they were consistent with other people who obtained these scores who have been shown through many studies to have these very specific traits. So externalization of blame, a lot of inner anger and hostility, sometimes that anger among these groups with similar scores, these people might have that anger kind of explode out at times. They tend to be very passive aggressive. They may be self-indulgent, very self-centered. They could use manipulation tactics to try to get their needs met, very needy of attention, acceptance, approval. They tend to distance people who are close to them. Initially, they may seem very charming. They're very socially sophisticated, actually. That was a major component on there. They have a capacity to kind of offer some of their faults, but in a way, but only the ones that people think of lightly and can all relate to. And so they can present as very fair and balanced, but in actuality, they really might be very judgmental of others and unaware of problems in their behavior and their thinking.
What's a code type?
A code type, let me think of how to explain this very simply. So the main scales, and I keep referring to scales, these are just the main scores that come up on this test. We can refer to them as codes. And when I was saying that Ms. Heard's scores could be compared to certain groups of people that had been researched before to obtain similar scores, the research has shown that certain people will have certain scores that kind of spike on this, okay? And so all of those traits that I was describing, those are traits that are found in these code types. So it means that score number two was high, and score number 6 was high. And so if we have those two scores were both high, then that's a 2-6 code type. And these code types...
What code type was Ms. Heard?
Ms. Heard had the clearest code type was 3-6, but then she also had some other code types that were less significant.
What characteristics are associated with a 3-6 code type?
So a 3-6 code type, a lot of that anger is expressed in this code type. There can be actually a lot of cruelty, usually with people who are less powerful. Actually, when you see this code type, you want to, if you can, to follow up with subordinates, co-workers, people who may have observed their behavior more closely. The 3-6 code type is very concerned with their image, very attention-seeking, very prone to externalizing blame to a point where it's unclear whether they can even admit to themselves that they do have responsibility in certain areas. A lot of suppressed and denied anger, but the anger is very present. will explode out, and a lot of issues in their close relationships.
How does Ms. Hurd's code type fit in with your overall opinion as to personality disorders?
Well, this might be an appropriate time to describe a little bit about these personality disorders, because I think what you'll hear is that there's a lot of consistency there. So borderline personality disorder is a disorder of stability. It's instability, and it's instability in personal relationships, it's instability in their emotions, it's instability in their behavior, and it's instability in their sense of self and their identity. And that instability is really driven by this underlying terror of abandonment. So one of the key features also of this disorder, and all of it is like pistons of an engine kind of firing off and igniting one another. But when somebody is afraid of being abandoned by their partner or by anybody else in their environment, and they have this disorder, they'll make desperate attempts to prevent that from happening. And those desperate attempts could be physical aggression, it could be threatening, it could be harming themselves. But these are behaviors that are usually very extreme and very concerning to the people around them. The anger is typically what, sadly, it's counteracted, right? So the thing these people fear most is being abandoned, but over time, the anger, the explosive anger that they show when somebody is needing space, or when somebody's really not doing anything wrong, because a lot of times they read into things that they perceive as being a slight to them or being somebody intending to harm them that actually isn't happening. They'll exaggerate it, and they'll explode. They'll react in this heightened manner that is just exhausting for their partners. Oftentimes their partners will try to make them happy at first and really allow themselves to be a punching bag, thinking that they can somehow solve this problem, that somehow they can make this better, and eventually it just overwhelms them. Histrionic personality disorder is very
Before
similar.
we move on from
Okay.
that, are you familiar with the term emotional reactivity?
I am.
What is that?
So emotional reactivity is very common in the diagnosis. So essentially, like I said, there's instability in emotions. People with borderline personality disorder are often misdiagnosed as having bipolar disorder because they can be up and down. They can look very depressed and they can look very elated, but these changes are happening within a matter of hours. Somebody with bipolar disorder, this is a clinical depression lasting days, weeks, a clinical mania where sometimes they even need to be hospitalized because they're so grandiose. They clear out their bank account and go to Vegas and spend it all. They're acting in some very bizarre ways. With borderline personality disorder, you're having these fluctuating moods constantly. And again, this hypersensitivity to being slighted or feeling offended, really driven by the fear that if you're offended or slighted, if the therapist comes in 2 minutes late, or if somebody shows up to dinner 2 minutes late, that they might be abandoning you. And it's not as if the borderline is considering themselves abandoned in that moment, but they just know that they have this overwhelming emotion, and there are no attempts to control that emotion. There are no attempts to regulate it. So if they're in the middle of the restaurant and they feel offended, they're going to start the fight. People are going to see it, or they might just start crying or break down, but they'll make a lot of accusations, and that reactivity is when you're going to see a lot of this escalation in the bizarre behavior. They can react violently, they can react aggressively, they will often physically prevent their partner from trying to leave if their partner wants to get space from all of this intense emotion, and oftentimes they will be abusive to their partners in these situations. Sometimes they'll physically restrain them from leaving and become injured that way, but also people with borderline personality disorder, it seems to be a predictive factor for women who implement violence against their partner. And one of the most common tactics that they'll use is actually physically assaulting and then getting harmed themselves. But mostly, we call this administrative violence. Essentially, this is saying that they'll make threats using the legal system. So They might say that they are going to file a restraining order or claim abuse, or they might do these things to essentially try to keep their partner from leaving. In the moment, again, they're not consciously thinking, I'm going to keep my partner from leaving right now. They're just thinking, I can't stand this. I hate my partner. They went from idealizing to suddenly devaluing because of the hurt, and they'll do anything to express that big emotion of anger.